In March of 1889, a photographer arrived at the Whitmore Academy for Young Scholars in rural Massachusetts with equipment that required absolute stillness. The resulting portrait shows 37 children arranged on wooden steps beneath a Gothic archway, their expressions frozen in that peculiar tension of enforced patience. But institutional records from that spring list 38 enrolled students. Somewhere between the ledger and the lens, a child vanished from the frame. The school's correspondence files contain no explanation. The photograph itself offers only silence, and the faint outline of something that should not be there, visible only when the image is held at a certain angle to lamplight. This is not a story about what was captured that day. It is a story about what was deliberately removed, and why the removal itself became more dangerous than the image it was meant to correct. If you are watching this now, wherever you are, whatever hour the clock shows, make note of it. Because by the time this investigation closes, the act of witnessing will feel different than it does in this moment. The photograph measures 8 inches by 10. It was printed on albumin paper, a process that required egg whites and silver nitrate, materials that yellowed with time and made every image an artifact of slow chemical decay. The edges show the brown foxing typical of 1889 studio work. But there is something else at the edges, a distortion in the emulsion, as though the image had been scraped and reprinted, then mounted over the original backing with an adhesive that did not fully set. Whitmore Academy stood 3 miles beyond the township of Ashford, accessible only by a carriage road that turned to mud each spring and froze into deep ruts by November. It was built in 1871 by Nathaniel Whitmore, a textile merchant whose fortune came from mills along the Quinebaug River. The building itself was constructed in the Gothic Revival style, pointed arches, steep gables, dark brick that seemed to absorb rather than reflect sunlight. Local families sent their children there not because of reputation, but because it was the only institution within reasonable distance that offered education beyond basic literacy. By 1889, the academy enrolled children between the ages of 7 and 14. They studied penmanship, arithmetic, scripture, natural philosophy, and what the prospectus called moral discipline through structured observation. The headmaster was a man named Josiah Carver, 51 years old, formerly a schoolmaster in Hartford, before a scandal involving financial improprieties forced his relocation. His employment file at Whitmore contains no reference to the Hartford incident. It was as though his life began the day he arrived at the academy. The students came from farming families, tradesmen, and a handful of modest mercantile households. Most lived within 5 miles. A few boarded at the academy during winter months when roads became impassable. The school kept meticulous attendance records, roll books bound in green cloth with each name entered in black ink. The spring term of 1889 lists 38 names. The photograph shows 37 faces. No annotation explains the discrepancy. The 38th name appears in the roll book on every attendance page from January through early March. Eliza Marsh, age 11, ward of the county. Her entry is consistent until March 14th, when the ink changes. The handwriting remains the same, Headmaster Carver's tight, slanted script, but the color shifts from black to a faded brown, as though a different pen or a much older ink was used. After March 14th, Eliza Marsh's name no longer appears in the daily roll. It is not marked absent, it is not marked withdrawn, it simply stops. County records from 1889 show that Eliza Marsh was remanded to Whitmore Academy by the Ashford Probate Court in October of 1888. Her parents had died the previous summer, her father from a threshing accident, her mother 3 weeks later from what the death certificate lists as nervous collapse. With no living relatives willing to claim her, Eliza became a ward of the court, and the court contracted with Whitmore Academy to house and educate her until she reached the age of 16. The contract still exists, filed in a leather portfolio in the basement archives of the Tolland County Courthouse. It is signed by Judge Amos Fielding and countersigned by Headmaster Carver. The monthly stipend was $12, paid quarterly. The last payment was issued on March 1, 1889. No subsequent payments appear in the ledger. No termination of the contract was ever recorded. March 19, 1889 was a Tuesday. Weather records from the New Haven Observatory note clear skies across Connecticut and western Massachusetts, with temperatures reaching 48 degrees by midday. The photographer's name was Cornelius Webb, a traveling portraitist who worked the rural circuit, visiting schools, churches, and civic organizations. His advertisement in the Ashford Courier promised likenesses of unimpeachable clarity, produced through the most modern collodion processes. Webb arrived at Whitmore Academy shortly after noon. His assistant, a young man named Thomas Millard, whose name appears in Webb's account book but nowhere else, helped unload the glass plates, the wooden tripod, the black focusing cloth, and the chemical baths required for development. The session was scheduled to last no more than 2 hours. 37 children were assembled on the front steps. Headmaster Carver stood to the left of the frame, his hand resting on the shoulder of the smallest boy. The exposure required approximately 15 seconds of absolute stillness. Any movement would blur the image, turning a face into a ghostly smear. The children were instructed to fix their gaze on a point just above the camera lens and to breathe shallowly. Webb ducked beneath the black cloth, removed the lens cap, and counted silently. When the count finished, he replaced the cap, withdrew the exposed plate, and handed it to Millard, who disappeared into the darkroom Webb had set up in the Academy's storage shed. But there is a problem with this account. Webb's personal diary, discovered in 1923 among the effects of his grandson, contains an entry for March 19, 1889. It reads, "Whitmore Academy, 38 children. Exposure interrupted. Plate reshot." Webb's diary does not specify what interrupted the first exposure. The entry for March 19th contains only the notation "plate reshot," followed by a single underlined word, "instruction." No further detail appears, but his account book shows an unusual charge to Whitmore Academy, an additional $3 beyond the standard sitting fee, listed as secondary exposure and plate disposal. The phrase "plate disposal" is not standard terminology. Webb's other entries from 1889 contain no similar charge. Thomas Millard, the assistant, left no diary. His name vanishes from Webb's account book after April of 1889. Census records show a Thomas Millard living in Worcester, Massachusetts, in 1890, employed as a dock worker, but the man's age does not match. There is no death certificate, no marriage record, no further trace. It is as though the Thomas Millard, who helped photograph Whitmore Academy, simply ceased to exist after the spring term ended. The storage shed where the darkroom was set up burned down in June of 1889. The fire marshal's report attributes the blaze to spontaneous combustion of chemical materials improperly stored. No investigation was conducted. No one was held accountable. The shed's remains were cleared and the ground left vacant. By autumn, wild grasses had reclaimed the site. But one detail survived the fire: a fragment of a glass plate negative discovered in 1931 during excavation for a new building foundation. The fragment measured approximately 2 inches by 3 inches. It showed a portion of the Academy's front steps, a section of Gothic archway, part of a child's sleeve, and, at the very edge of the frame, the blurred outline of a figure that did not appear in the final portrait. The fragment was examined by a photographic conservator in 1932. His report, filed with the Massachusetts Historical Society, describes the image as anomalous. The figure appears to be standing slightly apart from the group, positioned at the far right edge of the composition. The exposure captured only a partial silhouette, an arm, the curve of a shoulder, the suggestion of a head turned away from the camera. The conservator noted that the figure's positioning and posture were inconsistent with the choreography of a formal school portrait, where every subject is arranged to maximize visibility and symmetry. What made the fragment more unsettling was the texture of the image itself. The figure appeared to be in motion during the exposure, creating a blur that suggested either sudden movement or deliberate withdrawal from the frame. But the rest of the composition showed no motion blur. The other children remained perfectly still. The architecture was sharp. Only the figure at the edge defied the rules of the exposure. The conservator's report includes a single speculative sentence: "It is possible that this figure was removed from the final print through retouching or masking, though the motive for such alteration remains unclear." He appended a pencil sketch of the fragment, showing the approximate position of the figure relative to the Gothic archway. The sketch has been preserved. The fragment itself was lost during the 1938 hurricane that flooded the Historical Society's storage facility. In the weeks after the portrait was taken, Whitmore Academy returned to its routines. Morning assembly, scripture reading, lessons in penmanship and arithmetic. The spring term proceeded without incident. The Academy's correspondence files show letters to parents regarding tuition payments, requests for additional firewood, and a brief note from Headmaster Carver to the Ashford town clerk requesting copies of several students' baptismal records. But there is something missing from the correspondence: any mention of Eliza Marsh. No letter to the probate court explaining her absence. No request for a final payment. No notation in the headmaster's administrative journal indicating her withdrawal or transfer. The girl who had been enrolled since October, whose name appeared in the roll book every day until mid-March, simply vanished from all institutional memory. A seamstress named Ada Penfield, who lived a quarter-mile from the academy and occasionally mended the students' clothing, mentioned Eliza in a letter to her sister in April of 1889. The letter, preserved in a private family collection, includes this passage. I have not seen the Marsh girl in some weeks. I asked after her at the academy and was told she had been sent away, though no one would say where or why. There's an odd stillness about the place now, as though something has been decided but not spoken. Ada Penfield died in 1894. Her sister burned most of the correspondence after Ada's death, keeping only a handful of letters that mentioned family matters. The letter about Eliza survived by accident. It had been used as a bookmark in a Bible and was discovered in 1957 when the Bible was donated to a church sale. On May 3, 1889, Judge Amos Fielding sent a letter to Headmaster Carver requesting a progress report on Eliza Marsh. The letter was formal, written on the official stationery of the Tolland County Probate Court. It asked for confirmation that the girl remained in good health and satisfactory academic standing, and requested that the Academy submit its quarterly invoice for her continued care. Headmaster Carver's reply, dated May 7th, is brief. The matter of Eliza Marsh has been resolved in accordance with institutional policies. No further invoicing will be necessary. I trust this closes the account to the court's satisfaction. The letter is signed in Carver's hand, but the wording is evasive. It offers no specifics. It does not state that Eliza had been transferred, withdrawn, or released from the Academy's care. It simply declares the matter resolved. Judge Fielding did not reply immediately. His personal docket shows no further entries regarding Eliza Marsh until June 11th, when he noted, Carver's response insufficient. Request formal accounting, but no formal accounting was ever produced. The court's file contains no follow-up correspondence, no investigation, no demand for clarification. After June 11th, the probate court's interest in Eliza Marsh ceased. Judge Fielding died in 1891 of heart failure. His successor, Judge Harlan Price, inherited the court's files but showed no interest in revisiting old cases. The probate court's records from 1889 were archived in 1902 and transferred to the State Library in 1935. The Eliza Marsh file remained sealed until 1974, when a graduate student researching orphan placement policies requested access. By then, everyone who had been directly involved was long dead. In 1947, a woman named Catherine Birch was interviewed by a local history society in Springfield, Massachusetts. She was 73 years old, living in a modest apartment above a dry goods store. The interview was part of an oral history project focused on rural education in the late 19th century. Catherine had attended Whitmore Academy as a child. She was 10 years old in the spring of 1889. The interviewer asked her to describe a typical school day. Catherine spoke about morning prayers, slate work, the smell of chalk dust, the strictness of Headmaster Carver. Then, unprompted, she mentioned the photograph. We had our picture taken that year, she said, all of us standing on the steps, but there was a girl who wasn't in the picture, even though she should have been. I remember because she was standing right next to me when the photographer set up his camera, but when we saw the picture later, she wasn't there. No one ever explained it. The interviewer asked if Catherine remembered the girl's name. She hesitated. Eliza, she said finally. I think her name was Eliza. She was quiet. She had dark hair, she didn't talk much, and then one day she just wasn't at school anymore. We were told not to ask about her. The interview was transcribed and filed in the Springfield Historical Society's archives. It was never published. Catherine Birch died in 1951. The transcription was rediscovered in 2003 during a digitization project. By then, the Whitmore Academy had been demolished, and most of its records had been lost or destroyed. In 1889, Whitmore Academy maintained two sets of financial records. The first was a public ledger, kept in the headmaster's office, recording tuition payments, supply purchases, and routine operating expenses. The second was a private account book, known only to Headmaster Carver and the Academy's treasurer, a man named Silas Dorr. The private ledger recorded payments that did not appear in the public accounts, payments related to disciplinary matters, special accommodations, and what the ledger described as institutional discretions. The private ledger was discovered in 1968 in the estate sale of Dorr's great-granddaughter. It had been kept in a locked wooden box along with several other documents related to the Academy's finances. The ledger is bound in brown leather, measuring 6 inches by 9 inches, with entries written in Dorr's meticulous hand. On March 20th, 1889, one day after the school portrait was taken, an entry appears. Payment to C. Webb, Photographic Services, supplemental work, $3. Discretionary reimbursement authorized by J. Carver. 3 pages later, dated March 22nd, another entry. Transfer of funds, county ward relocation, $18. No receipt required. The phrase county ward relocation appears nowhere else in the private ledger. The amount, $18, was significantly more than the monthly stipend paid for Eliza Marsh's care. The entry provides no explanation of where the funds were sent or what relocation was being financed. It simply records the transaction and moves on. Silas Dorr was 62 years old in 1889. He had served as Whitmore Academy's treasurer since its founding in 1871, managing the institution's finances with an exactitude that impressed even the most skeptical auditors. He lived alone in a small house on the edge of Ashford, a widower with no children. His reputation was that of a man who kept to himself, attended church without enthusiasm, and maintained the Academy's books with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. But in the spring of 1889, something changed. Dorr began making errors in the public ledger. Small mistakes, easily corrected, but uncharacteristic for a man known for his precision. An invoice miscalculated by $2, a tuition payment recorded twice, a supply order attributed to the wrong vendor. The errors accumulated through April and May, then stopped abruptly in June. After that, Dorr's entries returned to their usual flawless state. Dorr's personal diary, discovered with the private ledger, contains only one entry from the period in question. It is dated March 23, 1889. Some decisions are made not because they are right, but because they are necessary. I pray I am not mistaken. The entry is followed by blank pages for the remainder of March. When the diary resumes in April, the tone is different, more detached, more transactional, as though the man writing had decided to stop recording anything that might later require explanation. Silas Dorr died in 1895 of pneumonia. His estate was modest, his house, a small savings account, and the contents of the locked wooden box. No family claimed the box. It passed through several hands before ending up at the estate sale, where it was purchased for $15 by a dealer in antique documents. The term county ward relocation had a specific meaning in 1889 Massachusetts. It referred to the transfer of orphaned or dependent children from one custodial institution to another, usually when the original placement was deemed unsuitable or when the child's behavior warranted stronger discipline. Such transfers were handled quietly with minimal documentation, and often involved institutions that did not advertise their purpose. Massachusetts in 1889 had several facilities that accepted relocated wards: reformed schools, almshouses, private asylums, and agricultural training farms. The largest and most notorious was the Fernald State School in Waltham, originally called the Massachusetts School for the Feeble-Minded. Children sent to Fernald were rarely released. They became permanent residents, their names erased from town records, their families notified only if death made notification unavoidable. Fernald's admission records from 1889 list 17 new residents between January and June. None of the names is Eliza Marsh, but several entries are incomplete. Admission dates recorded, but no originating institution noted. One entry, dated March 25, 1889, lists only female, age 11, ward transfer, name withheld pending family notification. No family notification ever occurred. The resident was assigned the institutional designation Ward 43F. She remained at Fernald until her death in 1936. The admission record for Ward 43F contains no photograph, no physical description, no notation of distinguishing features. It records only that she arrived with a single bundle of clothing and that she exhibited signs of melancholia and non-compliance with institutional authority. She was placed in the women's dormitory and assigned to the laundry. She never spoke to anyone who recorded her words. In 1912, Fernald State School commissioned a photographer to document its residents for a report to the state legislature. The photographer, a man named Arthur Vos, spent 3 weeks at the facility, taking portraits of staff, buildings, and selected patients. His negatives were preserved by his family and donated to the Boston Public Library in 1965. Among the negatives is a portrait labeled Laundry Staff, Women's Dormitory, 1912. It shows 14 women standing in a basement workroom, surrounded by wash basins and drying racks. Most of the women stare blankly at the camera. One woman, standing at the far right edge of the frame, has turned her face slightly away as though unwilling to meet the lens. She is approximately 34 years old. Her hair is gray, her hands are folded in front of her apron. The institutional record identifies her only as Ward 43F. A photographic analyst examining the 1912 portrait in 2011 noted that the woman's posture and positioning were remarkably similar to the blurred figure at the edge of the glass plate fragment from 1889. The fragment that had been excavated from the ruins of Cornelius Webb's storage shed. The tilt of the head, the angle of the shoulders, the sense of someone withdrawing from the act of being seen. The analyst wrote, "If this is the same individual, then we are looking at two moments 23 years apart, both defined by the same instinct to disappear." Eliza Marsh was not the only child to vanish from institutional records in Massachusetts during the late 1880s. Between 1885 and 1892, at least 12 other county wards, children remanded to schools, orphanages, and charitable homes, were transferred to undisclosed locations with minimal documentation. Their names appear in probate court files, then stop. No discharge papers, no forwarding institutions. Just the same vague phrasing: matter resolved, placement finalized, case closed. Most of these children were girls between the ages of 9 and 13. Most were described in court records as difficult, willful, or prone to disobedience. Most had lost both parents. Most had no relatives willing or able to assume custody. They existed in a legal gray zone. Not quite orphans, not quite criminals, but wards of a state that had little interest in tracking them once they became inconvenient. A study conducted by a Harvard sociology student in 1931 attempted to trace the fates of county wards placed in Massachusetts institutions between 1880 and 1900. The study identified over 200 children whose records simply ended. No death certificates, no marriage licenses, no census entries after their initial placement. The student concluded that many of these children had likely died in the institutions where they were sent, their deaths either unrecorded or recorded under false names. The study was never published. The student's advisor deemed it too speculative to meet academic standards. But the study's unpublished notes, archived at Harvard's library, include a handwritten addendum. Institutional erasure was not accidental. It was policy. Josiah Carver remained headmaster of Whitmore Academy until 1903. Under his leadership, the school maintained steady enrollment and a reputation for strict but effective pedagogy. He expanded the curriculum to include basic bookkeeping and agricultural science. He oversaw the construction of a new dormitory wing in 1895. He retired at the age of 65 and moved to a small house in Hartford, where he lived alone until his death in 1908. Carver left no family. His estate consisted of modest savings, a few pieces of furniture, and several boxes of personal papers. Most of the papers were routine, letters from former colleagues, receipts, old lesson plans. But one box, discovered by the estate executor, contained a leather-bound journal that Carver had kept intermittently between 1880 and 1905. The journal is not a diary. It contains no daily entries, no personal reflections. Instead, it is a record of decisions, brief notations, dated but unexplained, that Carver made over the course of his career. The entry for March 14, 1889 reads, "Marsh girl, probate arrangement untenable, alternative placement required, authorized." There is no further elaboration. The next entry, dated April 2nd, concerns the purchase of new textbooks. The journal was donated to the Connecticut Historical Society in 1911. It was catalogued but rarely consulted. In 1998, a researcher studying educational institutions in New England requested access. She found the March 14th entry and noted its vague wording. She attempted to locate records of the alternative placement Carver mentioned, but found nothing. The trail ended where it always ended, with silence. The technology of photography in 1889 was a technology of erasure as much as documentation. Glass plate negatives could be retouched with ink or paint to remove unwanted elements. Albumin prints could be masked during exposure to omit sections of the image. Figures could be added or subtracted, faces could be replaced, entire scenes could be reconstructed to match a preferred version of reality. Cornelius Webb was skilled in these techniques. His account books show multiple charges for corrective work and image refinement. He advertised his ability to remove blemishes and imperfections from even the most challenging compositions. For an additional fee, he could alter a photograph so seamlessly that no viewer would suspect the deception. But the alteration of the Whitmore Academy portrait was unusual even by Webb standards. The fragment of the glass plate negative, the one that showed the blurred figure at the edge, suggests that the first exposure captured something the school did not want preserved. Whether that something was Eliza Marsh or simply the evidence of her presence, the decision was made to erase it. The plate was reshot. The figure was removed. The final portrait showed 37 children, arranged in perfect symmetry, with no indication that anyone was missing. Webb's diary entry, "Exposure interrupted, plate reshot instruction," implies that the decision was not his. Someone at the academy instructed him to dispose of the first plate and create a new exposure. Someone paid him $3 additional to ensure that the correction was thorough. And someone, years later, burned down the storage shed where the evidence might have been kept. In 1889, children had no legal right to refuse institutional decisions made on their behalf. They could not contest their placement, challenge their treatment, or demand explanation for their relocation. They existed at the mercy of adults who controlled their fate. Judges, headmasters, asylum directors, charity administrators. If a child was deemed unfit for one institution, she could be transferred to another, without her knowledge or consent. If her behavior was judged troublesome, she could be reclassified as mentally deficient and sent to a facility where she would remain for life. Eliza Marsh had no advocate. Her parents were dead. She had no relatives willing to intervene. Judge Fielding, who had authorized her placement at Whitmore Academy, accepted Headmaster Carver's vague explanation without investigation. The probate court, which held legal authority over her welfare, closed her file and moved on. The photographer, who might have documented her absence, followed instructions and burned the evidence. The treasurer who recorded the transaction kept his silence until death. There is no record of Eliza Marsh objecting to her transfer. There is no record of anyone asking for her permission. The administrative language, "matter resolved, alternative placement, case closed," erased her from official memory as efficiently as the retouched photograph erased her from the visual record. She became a girl who had never existed. At least not in any way that the institutions cared to remember. The fire that destroyed Cornelius Webb's storage shed in June of 1889 was investigated by Ashford's volunteer fire marshal, a farmer named Cyrus Hale. His report, filed with the town clerk, concluded that the blaze resulted from spontaneous combustion of photographic chemicals improperly stored in a wooden structure during warm weather. The report noted that collodion, ether, and alcohol, all used in the wet plate process, were highly flammable and prone to ignition if stored without adequate ventilation. But Cyrus Hale's personal ledger, discovered in 1952 among family papers, contains a different account. On June 14, 1889, he wrote, "Called to Webb's shed, already engulfed, no attempt to save it. Millard present but would not speak. Webb claimed accident, but the way he looked at the flames suggested otherwise. Some fires are set to end questions." Hale made no official report of his suspicions. The town had no police force, and the state fire marshal's office did not investigate rural fires unless lives were lost. The shed was a total loss. Its remains were cleared within 2 weeks. Webb left Ashford shortly thereafter, moving his business to Rhode Island. Thomas Millard, the assistant, vanished from all records, and the glass plate negatives that might have provided evidence were reduced to molten slag and ash. If Eliza Marsh died at Fernald State School in 1936, there should be a death certificate filed with the Massachusetts Department of Vital Records. But no certificate exists under that name. The records for Fernald during 1936 list 43 deaths, each identified by institutional designation rather than given name. Ward 43F is not among them. A genealogist researching Fernald's burial records in 2005 discovered that many residents who died at the facility were buried in unmarked graves on the institution's grounds. The cemetery, located on a hillside behind the main building, contains over 200 burials dating from 1888 to 1945. Most graves are marked only by numbered stones, small granite blocks engraved with the ward designation and year of death. No names appear. The cemetery was closed in 1946 and left to grow over with brush and weeds. In 2009, a preservation society attempted to map the cemetery and identify the residents buried there. Using institutional records, they matched ward numbers to burial locations. But many records were incomplete or illegible, and several ward numbers could not be matched to any known resident. One grave, marked only with the number 43, contained no corresponding entry in the facility's records. The burial date was listed as 1936, but no name was attached. The Preservation Society placed a small marker at the grave with the inscription, "Unknown resident, Fernald State School, 1936. It remains the only acknowledgement that someone is buried there. In 1974, the Whitmore Academy photograph was donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society by the estate of a woman named Helen Carver, the niece of Josiah Carver. Helen had inherited several boxes of her uncle's possessions after his death in 1908, including the photograph. She kept it in a drawer for 66 years before deciding to donate it along with other historical materials. The photograph was catalogued and filed under Educational Institutions, Massachusetts, 19th century. It drew little attention until 1981, when a researcher studying child welfare policies came across it while browsing the collection. The researcher noticed the discrepancy immediately. The photograph showed 37 children, but the caption, handwritten on the back in Josiah Carver's script, read, "Whitmore Academy, Spring Term 1889, Full Enrollment." The researcher cross-referenced the photograph with the Academy's surviving records. The roll book listed 38 students. The caption claimed full enrollment, but only 37 faces appeared in the image. The researcher filed a query with the Historical Society, asking if any documentation existed to explain the discrepancy. The Society's archivist responded that no such documentation had been found. The photograph has been examined multiple times since 1981. Each examination reaches the same conclusion. The image shows evidence of retouching. A faint distortion is visible along the right edge of the frame, consistent with masking or inkwork used to remove a figure from the composition. The distortion is subtle, barely detectable without magnification, but unmistakable once noticed. In 1932, a commission appointed by the Massachusetts legislature investigated conditions at state institutions for dependent and mentally deficient persons. The commission held hearings across the state, interviewing staff, former residents, and family members. The final report, published in 1933, documented widespread neglect, abuse, and inadequate record-keeping at facilities including Fernald State School. One scheduled witness, a woman identified only as Mrs. M, was listed to testify about her experiences as a resident at Fernald between 1889 and 1920. But the day before her scheduled appearance, she withdrew from the proceedings. The Commission's notes indicate that Mrs. M had been located by investigators and had initially agreed to testify, but then declined to participate, citing health reasons. No further information about Mrs. M appears in the Commission's records. Her identity was never disclosed. The testimony she might have given was never heard. The Commission's final report makes no mention of her or the circumstances that led to her withdrawal. The section of the report dealing with Fernald focuses on conditions in the 1920s and 1930s, with only brief references to earlier decades. A researcher reviewing the Commission's files in 1996 found a handwritten note clipped to the page listing Mrs. M's scheduled testimony. The note, written in pencil, reads, "Subject extremely distressed, unable to proceed, recommend removal from witness list." The note is unsigned. In 2008, a team of historians analyzing the private ledger of Silas Dorr made a discovery that reframed the entire narrative. The entry dated March 22, 1889, transfer of funds, county ward relocation, $18, was followed 3 months later by a second entry that had previously been overlooked. On June 15, 1889, Dorr recorded, "Refund received, county ward matter, discrepancy unresolved." The phrase "discrepancy unresolved" suggests that something about the March transaction had gone wrong. $18 had been paid for a relocation. $6 had been returned. The remaining $12, exactly the amount of 1 month's stipend for Eliza Marsh's care, was unaccounted for. Dorr's entry offers no explanation. It simply notes the discrepancy and moves on. The historians attempted to determine who had issued the refund and why. They searched Fernald's financial records, probate court files, and county treasurer accounts. They found no matching transaction. The $6 appeared in Dorr's ledger, but nowhere else. It was as though the money had materialized from an institution that left no paper trail. One possibility is that the relocation Dorr paid for never occurred, that Eliza Marsh was supposed to be transferred to Fernald or another facility, but the arrangement fell through. Another possibility is that she was transferred, but the receiving institution charged less than anticipated and returned the surplus. A third, darker possibility is that the $12 that remained unaccounted for was payment for something else entirely, something that required no receipt and left no record. Catherine Birch, the student who remembered Eliza in her 1947 interview, was not the only former Whitmore Academy pupil still living in the late 1940s. There was one other, a man named Samuel Pierce, who had been 13 years old in 1889. Samuel lived in Vermont, worked as a postal clerk, and had never married. In 1949, a local newspaper in Rutland, Vermont published a brief article about Samuel to mark his 73rd birthday. The article mentioned that he had attended Whitmore Academy as a boy and recalled the strictness of Headmaster Carver. A researcher who had read about the missing photograph sent Samuel a letter in 1950, asking if he remembered the spring of 1889 and whether he recalled a girl named Eliza Marsh. Samuel did not reply immediately. 3 months later, a letter arrived. It was brief. "I remember the photograph. I remember the girl. I was told never to speak of her. I kept that promise for 60 years. I will keep it until I die." Samuel Pierce died in 1951. He left no further correspondence, no diary, no explanation. Whatever he knew about Eliza Marsh, he took with him. The researcher who had written to him attempted to interview other former students, but none could be located. By the early 1950s, everyone who had been at Whitmore Academy in the spring of 1889 was either dead or unwilling to speak. In 1955, the Massachusetts State Library consolidated records from defunct institutions, including schools, asylums, and reformatories that had closed in the early 20th century. Whitmore Academy, which had shuttered in 1919 after years of declining enrollment, had its remaining records transferred to the State Archive. The collection included correspondence, financial ledgers, student roll books, and miscellaneous administrative documents spanning from 1871 to 1919. The archive was housed in a storage facility in Worcester. In 1962, a fire broke out in the building due to faulty electrical wiring. The fire destroyed approximately 60% of the holdings, including most of the Whitmore Academy records. What survived was transferred to a climate-controlled facility, but the damage was irreversible. Letters, ledgers, and roll books that might have contained further details about Eliza Marsh were reduced to ash. A fire investigator's report concluded that the blaze had started in a section of the building where highly flammable nitrate film was stored. The fire spread rapidly, and by the time firefighters arrived, the entire wing was engulfed. The investigator noted that the building's fire suppression system had been deemed inadequate in a 1959 inspection, but no upgrades had been implemented due to budget constraints. It was the second time in 73 years that a fire had destroyed records related to the Whitmore Academy photograph. In 1977, the Massachusetts Historical Society received an unsigned letter postmarked from Boston. The letter, typed on plain paper with no return address, contained a single paragraph. "The girl in the photograph that isn't there was removed because she refused to stand still. Not because she moved during the exposure, but because she would not accept what was being done to her. They told her to be silent, and she would not be silent. So they made her silent in the only way they knew how. They erased her first from the image, and then from the record, and finally from memory. But erasure is not the same as disappearance. She is still there, at the edge of the frame, waiting for someone to see." The Historical Society's archivist filed the letter with the Whitmore Academy materials, but made no attempt to trace its origin. Anonymous correspondence was not uncommon, and the letter offered no verifiable facts. It read more like a statement of belief than testimony. Yet the phrasing, "waiting for someone to see," echoed Catherine Birch's 1947 description of the girl who should have been in the photograph, but wasn't. No second letter arrived. The author, whoever they were, sent only that single message, and then disappeared into the same silence that had swallowed Eliza Marsh. Between 1998 and 2007, a historian named Dr. Margaret Howland devoted nearly a decade to researching the Whitmore Academy photograph and the disappearance of Eliza Marsh. Howland, a professor at Boston University, had initially encountered the photograph while researching institutional treatment of orphaned children in 19th century New England. What began as a footnote in her research became an obsession. Howland traveled to archives across Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. She examined probate court records, institutional ledgers, fire marshal reports, cemetery records, and photographic collections. She interviewed descendants of Whitmore Academy staff and attempted to locate any surviving documentation related to Cornelius Webb and Thomas Millard. She commissioned forensic analysis of the photograph, hoping to reveal more about the retouching that had been done. In 2005, Howland published a preliminary article in the Journal of New England History titled "Institutional Erasure: The Case of Eliza Marsh." The article traced what was known about the girl's placement at Whitmore Academy, her disappearance from the records, and the evidence suggesting she had been transferred to Fernald. The article concluded with a blunt assessment: "We will likely never know what happened to Eliza Marsh with certainty. What we do know is that her erasure was intentional, systematic, and permanent." Howland continued her research until her death in 2009. She left behind boxes of notes, photocopies of documents, and correspondence with archivists. Her files were donated to Boston University, where they remain available to researchers. But even Howland, with her exhaustive efforts, could not fill the gaps in the story. The silence surrounding Eliza Marsh proved stronger than any amount of scholarly determination. In 2010, the Massachusetts Historical Society launched a project to digitize its photographic collections. The Whitmore Academy portrait was scanned at high resolution and made available online. For the first time, anyone with an internet connection could examine the image in detail, zooming in on individual faces, studying the architecture, analyzing the composition. Within months, the photograph attracted attention from researchers, genealogists, and amateur historians. Several online forums dedicated to historical mysteries began discussing the image and the story of the missing child. Theories proliferated. Eliza had died before the photograph was taken, and the school concealed her death. Eliza had run away, and the school erased her to avoid scandal. Eliza had been sold into labor, and the photograph was altered to remove evidence. Eliza had never existed, and the entire story was a clerical error, compounded by speculation. But one detail drew particular scrutiny. When the digital image was enhanced using modern software, the faint distortion along the right edge of the frame became more visible. It appeared as a subtle blur, a disruption in the pattern of bricks and shadows. Some viewers claimed they could see the outline of a figure, a suggestion of a shoulder, an arm, the edge of a dress. Others insisted it was nothing more than a photographic artifact, a trick of light and deterioration. The Historical Society issued no official statement on the matter. The photograph remained online, available for interpretation, speculation, and endless debate. In 2015, a coalition of advocacy groups petitioned the state of Massachusetts to allow exhumation and DNA testing of unidentified burials at Fernald State School. The goal was to identify as many of the unmarked graves as possible and provide proper memorialization for residents who had been buried without names. The state granted limited permission. Exhumations began in 2016, focusing on graves where some institutional record existed, but identification remained incomplete. Grave 43, the one marked with no name and a burial date of 1936, was among those selected for examination. The exhumation took place in May of 2016. Forensic anthropologists determined that the remains were those of a female, approximately 58 years old at the time of death. Evidence of malnutrition, untreated dental disease, and signs of prolonged manual labor were noted. DNA samples were extracted and entered into databases for potential matching with living relatives. No match was ever found. The woman buried in grave 43 had no traceable descendants, no relatives who came forward to claim her. She was reburied in the same location, and a new marker was placed with the inscription, "Female resident, Fernald State School, died 1936. Name unknown, not forgotten." If the woman in grave 43 was Eliza Marsh, then she spent 47 years at Fernald, worked in the laundry, spoke to no one who recorded her words, and died without anyone knowing her name. But the forensic evidence could not confirm this. It could only confirm that someone was buried there, and that someone had been forgotten. The Whitmore Academy portrait shows 37 children standing on stone steps beneath a Gothic archway. Their faces are solemn, their clothing is formal, dark wool, high collars, buttoned tight against the March chill. Some of the children look directly at the camera. Others gaze slightly to the side, their attention caught by something beyond the frame. Headmaster Carver stands at the left, his hand resting on a boy's shoulder in a gesture that might be protective or possessive. The image is carefully composed. The children are arranged by height, creating a symmetrical composition. The Gothic archway frames the group, lending a sense of institutional permanence. The exposure is sharp, the details clear. It is, by the standards of 1889 photography, a flawless portrait. But the photograph does not show the girl who stood at the edge of the frame during the first exposure. It does not show the moment when someone, Headmaster Carver, perhaps, or Cornelius Webb, following instructions, decided that her presence was unacceptable. It does not show Thomas Millard carrying the exposed plate into the darkroom, then returning to assist with a second exposure. It does not show the child being told to step aside, to leave the frame, to disappear. What the photograph shows is the result of that decision. 37 children, a space where a 38th child should have been, and a faint distortion along the right edge, visible only when the light is right, that suggests something was removed. Memory is not the same as record. Records can be destroyed, altered, hidden, or lost. Memory persists in other forms, in half-remembered stories, in letters written to sisters, in interviews given 60 years later, in the refusal to answer questions, in the silence that follows a name. Catherine Birch remembered a girl standing next to her during the photograph. Samuel Pierce remembered being told never to speak of someone. Ada Penfield noticed an absence and wrote about it to her sister. These memories, fragmented and incomplete, outlasted the official records. They survived fires, institutional closures, deaths, and decades of deliberate forgetting. What they could not do was restore what had been erased. Memory testifies to absence, but it cannot fill the absence. It can say someone was here, but it cannot always say who. It can insist something happened, but it cannot always explain what. Memory is evidence, but it is not resurrection. Eliza Marsh, if the woman in grave 43 was indeed her, spent most of her life in a place where memory was actively suppressed. Residents of Fernald were not encouraged to remember their pasts. They were given new designations, new routines, new identities constructed around labor and silence. The institution's goal was to erase the person they had been and replace her with the institutional role they would fulfill. For many, that erasure was total. In 1981, a man named Robert Webb contacted the Massachusetts Historical Society. He identified himself as the grandson of Cornelius Webb, the photographer who had taken the Whitmore Academy portrait in 1889. Robert had inherited several boxes of his grandfather's materials, including account books, correspondence, and a handful of glass plate negatives. He was writing to ask if the society would be interested in acquiring the collection. The society accepted the donation. Among the materials was Cornelius Webb's diary, the one that contained the entry about the interrupted exposure. But Robert Webb also included a letter he had found tucked inside the diary's back cover. The letter, undated and unsigned, was written in a hand Robert did not recognize. It read, "I am writing this so that someone someday will know. The girl was there. She stood with the others, but they would not allow her to be seen. I was told to remove her from the image and dispose of the plate. I did as I was instructed because I was paid to do so, but I am not proud of it. I am an accomplice to an erasure I do not fully understand. I do not know what happened to the girl afterward. I only know that I helped make her invisible." Robert Webb assumed the letter had been written by his grandfather, though he could not be certain. Cornelius Webb had died in 1919, and none of his immediate family had known about the Whitmore Academy photograph or the circumstances surrounding it. The letter had remained hidden for over 60 years before Robert discovered it. The Historical Society cataloged the letter and filed it with the other Whitmore materials. It remains one of the few pieces of direct testimony about the photograph's alteration. The question is not whether Eliza Marsh existed. The probate court records, the roll book, the county stipend payments all confirm her existence. The question is not whether she disappeared. The absence from the records, the interrupted photograph, the vague explanations all confirm her disappearance. The question is, why? Was she transferred to Fernald because she was deemed mentally deficient, as the institution's admission criteria required? The evidence suggests she was not. Her enrollment at Whitmore Academy lasted 5 months without incident. No notation in the roll book suggests behavioral problems or cognitive impairment. The phrase used in Carver's journal, "probate arrangement untenable," does not describe a child who needed stronger institutional control. It describes a legal or financial complication. Was she removed from the photograph because her presence would have raised questions the school preferred not to answer? If so, what questions? And why would those questions be dangerous enough to warrant erasure? The most unsettling possibility is that Eliza Marsh was removed not because of anything she did, but because of what she represented, an inconvenience. A ward whose care was paid by the county, whose placement was temporary, whose existence created paperwork and oversight that the academy found burdensome. Institutions in 1889 had broad discretion to relocate or reclassify children who became difficult to manage. If Eliza had objected to something, her treatment, her isolation, her future, her objection could have been redefined as defiance, and defiance could have been redefined as pathology. In that interpretation, the erasure from the photograph becomes not an isolated act, but a symbol of a larger institutional practice, the systematic removal of children who refuse to be silent. In 2017, a group of descendants of Fernald residents proposed the construction of a memorial on the facility's grounds. The memorial would list the names of all known residents who had died at Fernald and been buried in unmarked graves. Fundraising efforts began, and an architect was commissioned to design the monument. But the project stalled when researchers realized that many of the names could not be verified. Institutional records were incomplete, death certificates were missing, or listed only ward numbers. Some residents had been buried under false names or no names at all. The list of confirmed names grew slowly, and the list of unknowns grew faster. In 2019, the project was revised. Instead of listing individual names, the memorial would bear a single inscription, in memory of those who were forgotten, in recognition of those who cannot be named, in acknowledgement that erasure is not the same as non-existence. The memorial was completed in 2021. It stands on a hillside overlooking the old cemetery. It is made of polished granite, and it reflects the light in such a way that, depending on the time of day, the surface appears either transparent or opaque. A fitting monument for people who were made invisible. Eliza Marsh's name does not appear on the memorial, but if she is buried in grave 43, then she is among those being remembered, even if she cannot be named. In 2022, the Massachusetts State Library launched a digitization project focused on surviving records from 19th century institutions. Among the materials selected for scanning were the remnants of Whitmore Academy's files that had survived the 1962 fire. The project aimed to make these records accessible to researchers, genealogists, and anyone seeking information about relatives who had passed through the institution. The digitized records revealed nothing new about Eliza Marsh. The gaps in the documentation remained gaps, but they did reveal something about the broader pattern of institutional record-keeping. Many county wards who had been placed at Whitmore Academy between 1871 and 1919 had incomplete or inconsistent records. Names appeared and disappeared. Stipend payments were recorded irregularly. Discharge dates were often missing. The pattern was not unique to Eliza Marsh. It was systemic. One researcher reviewing the digitized files noted that the inconsistencies were most pronounced for female wards. Boys' records tended to be more complete. Their placements were tracked more carefully. Their discharges were more thoroughly documented. The researcher concluded that institutional attention followed a hierarchy of perceived value. Boys were monitored because they were expected to become productive members of society. Girls, especially those deemed difficult or dependent, were monitored less rigorously because their futures were considered less consequential. The researcher published her findings in 2023 under the title Gendered Erasure in 19th Century Child Welfare Institutions. Eliza Marsh was one of several case studies cited in the paper. The Whitmore Academy photograph still exists. It is preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society's climate-controlled storage. It has been digitized, analyzed, enhanced, and debated. It has been the subject of academic papers, online discussions, and memorial efforts. It has outlasted the institution it depicts, the people it shows, and the person it erased. When you look at the photograph now, knowing what you know, the image changes. The 37 children no longer appear as a simple school portrait. They appear as witnesses to an absence. The Gothic archway no longer frames institutional permanence. It frames a question. The faint distortion along the right edge no longer looks like a photographic flaw. It looks like evidence. The photograph does not answer the question of what happened to Eliza Marsh. It only confirms that something happened. Something deliberate, something systematic, something that required erasure to conceal. The photograph is not a record of the past. It is a record of what the past refused to record. And perhaps that is the point. Some truths persist not because they are documented, but because their absence is so conspicuous that it becomes its own form of testimony. Eliza Marsh was removed from the photograph, but the photograph in its incompleteness continues to testify to her removal. The silence surrounding her disappearance has lasted longer than any explanation ever could have. She stood at the edge of the frame, and then she was gone. But the frame still shows the space where she stood. And in that space something remains. Not a figure, not a name, but the echo of a question that no institution could fully silence. What happens to the children who refuse to disappear?